an aircraft engineer.
My father taught people to design televisions, and he ran the electrical engineering department at Claddiff Tech. And I didn't particularly think school was much fun, so I didn't go very often. And there was a job for Cambrian to work in that involved 4 years in London. And I went for the interview, and they said, you know, what do you know about planes? And I said, nothing. I know a lot about ships. And they said, well, why don't you know anything about planes? And I said, because I live on the coast. So all I know about is ships. But, you know, there's nothing, it's only engineering. It's the same sort of philosophy. And jumbos were about to come out, and I knew that the perfect dynamic shape was an egg. And that if you threw an egg flies through the air really, really well. So I suggested to them that perhaps this was why jumbo jets were being designed the way they were, and talked about pitot heads, which are the things at the end of the wing that takes the tailspin, and aerodynamically gets rid of it and stops the plane from doing stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And they were sort of impressed. So they gave me the job. And I previously used to go down to Barry to the scrapyard where the trains go to die.
Yes, yes.
And done sort of still lifes. And there was a guy that took pictures of planes taking off, and he had this long lens, and I borrowed it and did, I think I did Led Zeppelin and The Who in like 71, 72. And then in 73 I did the first date on the Ziggy Stardust tour was at Earl's Court, and I did that. And back then it was BEA and BOAC, they were yet to merge. And BOAC had a camera club which had a darkroom. And so I joined that, and I put this David Bowie picture in this competition. I won it. And this big gruff man comes over to me and says, where'd you take that picture? And I said, oh, you know, I took it at Earl's Court. And he said, did you have permission? I said, no, actually I didn't. And he said, well, my name's Bill West, and I'm the stage manager for the Rank organisation, and we own all the theatres. And I think you have talent. He said, so if you phone me, I'll get you in. And he said, David Bowie's going to retire with these 2 gigs. And he said, just ring me and I'll get you a pass. But he said, but go on the second night because there won't be anybody else there. So I went on the second night, and I got home and I had like 20 some pictures that were really good. And I thought, oh, maybe I should do this. Maybe this is sort of like my calling. And so then for the next 2 years, I learned how to take pictures, but I didn't have enough money for film. So I would pretend to take pictures for the first 2/3 of the show, and then put my little roll of film in for the encores. And I didn't show anybody anything. Never published the Bowie pictures for 40 years, which obviously was something that was the harbinger of a philosophy of long-term planning.
Yes.
And Joe Stevens, who had sort of encouraged me and sort of mentored me, took me into the NME and introduced me to Tony Tyler, who was actually Daniel Craig's godfather. And he said, go and get an American Express card and a passport and come back. So I did that and came back, and he said, okay, go home, pack a suitcase and never unpack it, because I'm just going to send you places, and you know, you've got the job. And so I started working on the NME in 1975.
So consequences, just luck? Or do
Yeah,
you think,
absolutely.
or preordained, do you reckon, Chalkie?
I wouldn't go that far. I think I was always the two big influences. There were 3 big influences on me. The 3 sleeves. The first was Adam Hart Mother, where it was a cow, and I thought, this is really cool. You can photograph a cow instead of the group. Mm-hmm. And then the second one was Medal, and on the inside of Medal it had the 4 guys on a white background. But it wasn't a picture of 4 people. It was 4 pictures of 4 individual people, and it was overlaid. And I didn't know it at the time, but the way that hypnosis worked was to create pictures that looked like they were taken on lenses that didn't exist. Right. So they would take Hasselblad pictures and do 3 of them, and then strip it into a wide a gatefold. And the Floyd pictures were taken separately.
Right.
And I'd figured that bit out because there was a vertical version of it. And I'm like, how can there be a vertical version of this if it's a group shot?
Yeah.
And the third one was Deep Purple live with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. And it was an interior of the Albert Hall, the whole of the Albert Hall. And the group were in a box, so they were tiny. And I thought, this is really cool. You can A, photograph cows, and B, you can make the group minuscule. That's got to be a cool job.
Yeah.
And so that's what I, wanted to do. I think that was the influence. And then the rest of it is you get a lucky break, and it occurred at the right time. And I had a great empathy with musicians.
Right.
Like, the museum's not allowed to use the word celebrity or famous faces or anything even close, because that's not what they are. They're pictures of musicians.
Yes.
And that's the link in everything.
And were you a musical person?
Well, sort of, because in order not to go to school, I figured out that if you played the cello, because it was such a big instrument, you could go to music classes, but the music classes weren't at school, they were in a church. But this meant that you couldn't get the cello on the bus to school because the bus was full. So therefore you had to get the bus an hour later.
Right.
And then you had to leave to get your cello to the church. You had to miss the first class, plus the music class, plus the class coming back. And then you had to leave early to get the bus that came before the school bus. So I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. So I did that for a while, and then it also was part of the Welsh National Youth Orchestra, which meant going to Pontypridd on Saturdays to rehearse. And it sort of got me away from home, and I thought, oh, that's a good idea.
Right. No, it's really funny you should say, because I hated school as well. It was when I went to a school in Swansea, and I was bullied. And so I spent most of my time there were 5 cinemas in Swansea, so I spent most of my time in cinemas. And my mother still doesn't know the fact that I used to go and see. I think the first film I saw was The Icarus File, which really blew me away.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I spent hours in and being chased and having to do detention and all that sort of silly stuff. But the mechanics of the camera, I guess you didn't find the mechanics of a camera a problem?
No. I think what happened was that once you've taken an engine off a plane, you realise that even though you could get paid £600 a month in 1970, it's not much better than working in a garage and changing tyres. I was an electrical engineer, not I forget what they were called. They were the oilies and the sparks, and I was one of the sparks. But my father's camera was an Agfa rangefinder, but I bought a Zenith B.
Gosh,
with no light meter.
Oh right, yes.
And
what lens did you have on it? The 50mm Helios, I guess, was it?
I had the 50mm, and I had a 200 Tarragon, I think. Right. But they were manual lenses, so that meant that if you shut them down, it got darker. Yeah. But you couldn't shut them down really, because the exposures for rock and roll in those days were, basically a 15th and a 30th.
Yes.
2.8 at most, and if it got really bright, you could possibly get f4.
Yes.
And so you had to learn to hold a camera at a 15th.
Yes.
And that's why Hammersmith was good, because you could put your elbow on the stage and sort of steady the camera.
Right.
And then I went from a Zenith to the screw-in Pentaxes, because everybody had Nikons, but they were too expensive. And the Pentax had screw lenses,
right, yeah.
which meant that they were more difficult to change. And then they came out with, I think it was the K2, that had an automatic shutter based upon the exposure. And I used that, I liked that. And then that had a bayonet mount.
Yeah.
So I had that and I didn't like the 50. Thought the 35 was a very overrated lens. So I had a 24 and a 105 macro. Because I'd always liked macro photography. And I used that. And then motor drives were, I think the F1 motor drive had 16 AA batteries. And it was like this big underneath an already heavy camera. And the Fleet Street guys had those. And so I think Pentax were the first people to make a power winder.
Right.
Which was basically a cheap version of a motor drive.
Yeah.
But I still think that was cheating. And that the worst thing is the ability to take lots of pictures.
I agree, yeah.
I mean, you didn't take many of me. I don't know if you took one.
I took 6 shots.
6.
Yeah.
And so I shot very sparingly. And I was never like the phallic symbol of the camera sticking out of your chest. I always had the camera behind my back, if I had it at all. Because I often just wouldn't bring it out for days. And then I'd just take a few pictures of people. And there's a Clash cover of the NME with the Paul in the centre and the two of them on the side. Mm. And Bernie Rhodes wanted because it was democratic, that each member of the group had to be in the centre. So I did all 3 versions in 14 frames.
Right.
And then looking back through the negs, that's how I seem to have done everything. Like 1 frame here and 1 frame there. Yeah. And I think, when I worked my way from 35mm to a Hasselblad in 79, and then I did that, did Hasselblads because it was square and record covers were square. But then that became too easy, so I moved to 4.5. And I thought, why not make life a little more difficult? Upside down, dark slides, and stuff like that. And then when I went to America, Condé Nast had very deep pockets, so I moved up to 810. Right. But I also used the 2024 Polaroid, right, and did some jobs with that. But I think what would happen, when I was talking to Karis Matthews today about it, that the first Polaroid is always the best, and then you spend hours trying to get that again.
Indeed. So
to me, the only advantage of digital is that you can see it, and you can agree it, and that you don't have to go back and do it. But I sort of refer to it as photographic diarrhea, and think that there's far too many people taking far too many pictures. Yeah. And when I hear of photographers dumping digital pictures whilst they shoot to clear the card, I'm like, why did you take that in the first place?
Indeed, yeah. I found that in my own work, I'm actually shooting a lot less when I was filling cards when digital first came out. There's no point, and you adapt, and you know what's in your head and what your eye is seeing. Yeah. Where does all the precision come? Because there's a precision in your work as well. I mean, there's the photojournalism work which you were doing at the beginning with the NME. But there's a precision work there that you would do in studio. Where does that precision come from, Chalkie? Is it something innate in you?
Yeah, I unfortunately have always been a perfectionist. So this meant that if my toys were scratched, I threw them away. So I ended up with no toys. And you work within the frame you're given, so you watch you watch the edge of the frame, and if you look at the master photographers, you'll notice that that's what they do. Yes. And unless there's a really good reason, I mean, with 810, like if you want an 810 of this much, you've got from this part of the nose, the nasal part of the nose, to just past the eye. Yes. That's sharp. Yes. So the way you get around that is you get a tennis ball that you put on the end of a C-stand arm, and you put that behind the person, and their neck touches that. And as long as their neck's touching that, then they won't move backwards. But the thing about 810 is, you just wait for them, and if they don't give you the look, then you just don't take a picture. And after a while, they get the message. But having trained as an aircraft engineer where precision is required, because if you do things wrong, planes fall out of the sky and people don't like that.
Yeah.
It's just an innate thing that I've always done, and I think watching Stanley Kubrick's films had a lot to do with it. It was very interesting actually, because I met his daughter, and she made a film on The Shining for Alan Yentob, and he said, do you want to make another film? And she said, yeah, I'd like to make one on Squeeze. So Chris Difford said to me, I've got to go and meet Stanley's daughter, why don't you come? And so I went, and I said to her, ask your dad something. I said, from what I can tell, other than the cover of Time that he did himself, he's never had his portrait taken. I said, I would really love to do it. And I think that, we would get on. I said, we have some friends in common, tell him I know Murray close. And he gave her a 45-minute explanation of why I couldn't do it. And that he'd only ever been photographed working.
Right.
And he didn't have a problem with that. But no way was he going to, sort of sit. But you look at his films and they're perfectly composed.
Yes.
And they're symmetrical.
Yes.
And there's a lot of symmetry in my work. And it's just the way that I see. I mean, I didn't take pictures for 20 years. I never carried a camera, other than at work, because that's what I did for a living. So I never took pictures for fun. And I have no pictures in my house. And the way that I worked in America was I had 4 or 5 cameras. You would think the picture was taken from the front, but it's actually taken from above. You take it on glass, what's called water white glass, which is $600 for a square meter. And then you light the floor, and then you black card the glass, but you can also black card the floor. And then we had video cameras on the back of the 4 or 5 cameras, so that we composed on TV screens. So we were doing that in, 1990. And I'd consulted with Leaf and CNR for a decade about digital, and said that, once they could give me something that would give me a decent sized file, I'd consider converting it. And the two clients I thought I was best for were Apple and Clinique. And I ended up working for Apple for about 5 years. And
can I ask you if that was an exclusive contract then? I mean, did you just work for Apple exclusively, or were you working for other people as well?
I didn't work for any other computer companies.
Right. Okay.
I've always worked for specific people and not other people. So I never worked for anything but the NME and The Face, because I wasn't interested in it. And I didn't work for any of Apple's competitors, even though it wasn't in my contract to do so. It just didn't seem like the right thing to do.
Okay.
And I would go out to Cupertino twice a year and do the products. And Steve's philosophy was that what was on the box was what was in the box, so you couldn't have comps. But you could do Frankenstein lighting, which meant that you could light a computer 4 or 5 different ways and put the pieces together, but you couldn't retouch. So if you wanted a highlight, you had to make it a highlight. And I was working for Martha Stewart doing flowers for a while, and one of the art directors went to Clinique, and then she phoned up and said Irving Penn's wife was very ill. He needed someone to, his studio needed to slow down a bit. And I knew his people because my printers in London, Mike Spry, he used to do Donovan and Bailey and Jane Bown and Sally Soames and Don McCullum, and he was the best printer in London, and he had what's called a point light source. And a point light source is, instead of an enlarger bulb, It uses a car headlamp. And you float the negative in oil between two sheets of glass.
Wow.
And you get super high definition. And everybody used to use a 150mm Hasselblad lens, but I used a 120, which was a 50s lens that was designed for open heart, for medical photography. And it had Proxar lenses that were like £300 for a lens, and you put those on the front, and what that does is that fixes the distance between the lens and the person. So you don't focus at that point, you move the camera further forwards. That would allow you to get in here, and the 150 gave you the postage stamp picture, and I hated the postage stamp picture because it wasn't close enough. And so that particular lens, which was late, I think it's 58 or 59 it was made, and we have it in the museum, was very, very sharp. And so you couple that with a point light source and a person that's interested in quality, and you shoot pan F at 25 or 32 ASA.
Yeah.
And then you have to have ND filters because your colour film is faster. So you've got to constantly be putting ND filters on. And,
right.
And I worked with my wife with 2 cable releases. I had the short one and focused, and she had the long one behind her back. And I liked people looking miserable, and she liked people smiling. And so we were able to hit the button at the same split second, which everybody thought was really cool, but I mean, jazz people do that every day. Yeah. It's nothing special. But we even had it down to the fact where I was able to take pictures with my tongue by putting the cable release in my mouth and rewinding film backs whilst I shot. And I developed a way of working where you didn't actually talk to the person that you photographed.
Right, okay.
You just, you know, did this. And sooner or later they'd follow you.
Yes.
And I've thought that if you could take pictures without talking to them, that was a kind of a pure way of doing it.
A very pure way of doing it.
And I think purity is you know, very important. And I also learned early, like I didn't know at first, because at first, you know, you're too frightened to talk to the people, you know, because the publicist tells you, well, you know, you can take pictures while the journalist's talking to them, but you know, you can't talk to them, you're just a photographer. And I think it was McCartney that I did, and I didn't like what he was doing, and I asked him to do something, and he did it. And I thought, that's interesting. And I did Townsend, I think, a few weeks later, and I did the same thing, and it worked. And I thought, this is good. This is kind of power. You can tell them what to do. And so once I figured you could tell them what to do, then I sort of took control of it.
Did that power though come from you actually knowing them and being? I mean, and you knew them beforehand. You hadn't stuck a camera in front of them immediately. I mean, I presume you had conversations with them. They must have been in a relaxed state of mind with you, Chalkie.
Well, I would always insist on meeting the person before I photographed them.
Right.
Even if it was for 30 seconds.
Right.
And I did I used to go to Top of the Pops a lot, where I could just walk in. And that would allow me, part of the reason for the anonymity was that nobody knew what I looked like. So therefore nobody would recognize me. So I could go and I could watch groups and see how you stood and see how you acted and observe you and figure out whether or not, you know, I wanted to work with you. I only worked with people that I liked. I never did anybody that I didn't like. And then, you know, I went back to the NME and said, look, you know, this business of photographing people when they're talking is really boring. You know, why don't we start posing them? And they were like, oh no, they'll look like press pictures. And I said, no, why don't we do that? And why don't we do studio pictures? The NME hadn't run studio pictures in about a decade, since like the Monkeys. And so my first white, I mean, it's grey because it's against a wall, but that Clash picture is April 77.
Yeah. So
I was already in the studio then, and that was taken with an inflatable sort of softbox that went on a Vivitar.
Right.
because I was always very, very technical, so that helped.
Yes.
And then I started schlepping, I guess they were Bowen's lights that wear the pack and the head were the same thing, except that the umbrella didn't go through the center, it went through the bottom, so that meant that your light was off. So what I really needed was Balcar, because Balcar was the real light, but Balcar's had a reputation for being dangerous.
Right, okay.
That if you got an electric shock off a Balcar, it threw you across the room.
Right.
And the first Balcars I had, I bought off of Harry Pacanotti, and they were the controls were hand etched by a guy with, you know, like a vibrating thing. And so I started to use Balcar and Balcar umbrellas, because the guy that invented Balcar was the first person to use an umbrella as a light source. And they had white umbrellas, silver and white zebra umbrellas, and then they had a diffuser that went on the front of the umbrella. And I learned lighting from Bailey, because every time I go to the printers, his pictures would be in the wash. And so I just look in the eye. And if you look in the eye, you can learn everything about the picture.
Yes.
And that's what I was trying to explain to the BBC the other day was, you know, they said, where do you want to be, where can we do you in the museum? And I said, well, you know, the Elizabethan room. And they're like, why? And I'm like, well, because that's where it all starts. And they're like, but that's not very rock and roll. And I'm like, why would I want to do something rock and roll? Don't you understand about Holbein? You know, Holbein invented retouching. Because he would go out and do Anna Cleves and take one look at Anna Cleves and go, my God,
Yes.
what am I going to do here? Would, you know, calm down, you know, tone down Anna Cleves enough to make it almost that she wasn't that attractive. Take it back to Henry, who would sort of go, oh my God, do I have to marry that? And Holbein would say, well, kind of, you know, marriage and all this sort of stuff. And Holbein, I think, tread a very thin line. And, you know, between him and, say, Botticelli, who softened the faces, then you get portraiture. And I'd learned from watching The Godfather that I noticed that in all the major scenes, you only ever saw one ear. You never saw two.
Yeah.
And so I started listening to, after I listened to rock and roll, everything from, you know, the beginning of rock and roll in the 50s through to the 80s, and then I got bored with it. So then I listened to jazz and reggae for a decade. And then I got into classical music, and Elvis and I both got into it simultaneously. And so I went from the 11th century to the 21st century. And I started listening to Hildegard von Bingen, and then a lot of polyphony, which is John Tavener and William Byrd. And the sleeves had these paintings. And again, I saw this thing of only one ear. Unless they were religious and had the hats that covered the ears, yes, no one ever did it. And so I sort of took the BBC guys in there, and there were 3 pictures on the wall. And I said, well, you know, this guy at the top is obviously a church person, because the light starts at about 12 feet and then probably goes up 30 feet. And then this guy here is probably, you know, in a big wing of his house, because the light starts at about 4.5 feet, goes up about 10, 12 feet. And then this picture here, this person's in a small room and he's lit with probably a window light, like a small light. And he's not very rich because his picture isn't that great. And they sort of look at me and say, how on earth do you know this? And I'm like, it's obvious. You just look in the eye. Like, photographers are nothing special, right? I mean, these are 500-year-old paintings. I mean, there's no perspective, because they hadn't learned perspective, because Brunelleschi hadn't come along yet. And then they said, you know, like, what's your favorite thing in the museum? And I said, it's this couple. This picture over in the corner of this, I forget, he was the lord of something, but he was obviously an incredible landowner. But he's painted with his wife, but they're holding hands. It's very rare. And you start looking at the detail, and the woman's got a double chin and the double chin is painted in. It's not fixed. And the level of quality of the lace, you know, indicates, you know, how much money they had compared to rough lace. And it depends on who you talk to, but there are people that will tell you that the reason for roughs was to throw light back up on the faces so that people looked better. But I've always used turtleneck sweaters to do the same thing, as to isolate the face, or wrap people in black cloths. Yes. Or, you know, like with Dave Gilmour, you get a leather jacket and you put the collar up and then you put the light down here and then you cast a shadow that gives you a line across the chin, and then that knocks, you know, 5 pounds off. Yes. Because we didn't have retouching. We had retouching. I had a guy called Les Grenier, and he worked for Lichfield amongst other people, and he was a real expert at spots. And what he would do is get a scalpel, and if that was like a zit, he'd put a tiny, tiny X, and then the minutest bit of dye would go into the X and then flood the X, and the spot would just disappear magically. So I used knifing and that back then, not to change a picture, but just to deal with, you know, spotty youths, really. And so, you know, to me, it's all that. And I said to the guy that it was in the gallery, because I needed to check out the gallery, because I wanted to use a much bit. They had offered me a room at the back, a Victorian room, and I'm no offence to Victorians, but I always find that hideous. And but there was a huge gallery outside it, so I went and I started talking to the guards, and I said, how many people come through here in a day, and, you know, what time do you close, and what would happen if I asked for these doors to get closed at 4 o'clock instead of 4:45? And she's like, you're asking some very odd questions. I said, no, it's okay, just asking questions. And so in the morning I went to the museum and I said, I'd like to use this big room if possible, rather than this small room, you know. They said, but you're only doing a headshot, can't you use a hot conference room? And I'm like, no, it's not about that, it's about the environment. You know, there's this huge, massive room with all these paintings on it, and it would be cool to work in here. So I took a picture of it and put it on Facebook. And then a bunch of museum employees liked it and made comments. And I said, you know, wouldn't this make a great portrait studio? And of course they didn't realize what I was actually asking for. And I was basically sort of saying, well, you know, can I use this room? And then one of them said, well, actually that's where people get married. I said, so it's a good room. I said, there's only 4 benches. All you've got to do is move the 4 benches to the sides, and I'll just work in the middle. And part of this thing for the one show included photographing Keris. And I just thought, if you put her in there, she'll feel kind of better about it. And it would be an enjoyable experience. And also, I'm used to massive rooms, because New York studios are big, and, you know, my studio was 4,000 square feet. But, you know, the technical thing, I mean, they sent me 50 pages of Irving Penn's ads and said, learn how to do this. And there's some really simple but very clever tricks. So the first thing is that he's 1 degree below the center line. And the second thing is, if you've got a beauty product and you put a quarter underneath it, it'll lift it off the surface and you'll get a shadow. Yeah. And then he realized that Clinique products had silver C's which would reflect black. And so instead of having a Clinique product, they were handmade comps that were $330 a piece, that were hand lettered and hand crimped, and the plastic bottles were made of glass. And he would hot glue these together, which cost a fortune. But, you know, he's Irving Penn. And so they said to me, you know, do you think you could learn how to do this? And I'm like, yeah, it's not very difficult. And so I took the first pictures, and I just took I'd learned from Toscani that you could just get rid of everything, get rid of the reflector, and you've got a bare head. And Terry Donovan had said to me, I'll teach you photography. There's one sun in the sky, so you only need one light in the picture. Black and white's got a latitude of 7 stops. Colour film's got a latitude of 2 stops. That's it. Let's talk about life. And Toscani's technique was either, you know, 3 umbrellas or just a bare head. So I tried the bare head thing and did it, and then Clinique phoned up and they said, have you ever considered HMI? And I said, no. And they said, we think you might like one. So I thought, okay. So I phoned my camera guy and said, what's an HMI? And he said, well, that's a flicker-free movie light. I said, do you sell those? He said, yeah. And I said, I need 6. And he's like, you need 6? I said, yeah. He said, they're $4,500 a piece. I said, okay. He said, the bulbs are $500. I said, yeah, but I've got a job, and I think this is what I need. Because Clinique wanted me to have 3 sets, so that you could be working on one, striking one, and prepping one. Because there were these ladies called beauty gods who named the products and made my life hell. And sometimes they would change the name, and Penn would just say, I'm not doing it again. So they'd send me his 810, and then they'd send me the product with the new product name on it, and then I'd have to do the same picture so they could drop my picture into his picture, because he, you know, could be a bit sort of cantankerous on occasion. And they'd once sent him an art director, and he locked him in a cupboard. And so they never sent art directors. They sent drawings. And I had never been art directed in England, and so we had a studio policy of you just couldn't come, no matter who you were. And you couldn't phone, because if you phoned, 6 people would be disturbed. So you could fax us questions. But working out at Apple, and I bought, CNR created a thing called a macro scan. A macro scan went on the back of a 4.5, took a Philips satellite, spy satellite chip, took 4 passes in the top left-hand corner, RGBG, because green is difficult, moved the chip over, took another 4, went down, and then across, took 16 exposures, overlapped them, used a thing called NASA Photo Stitch, which was $800 per program per computer, and you got a 32 meg file in 1999.
Right. Good God.
And so it had cost $1 million to build the first studio, and 700,000 to turn it digital. So I turned it digital in '99, because the shutters are $10,000. The lenses, whereas even an 810 lens, like even the 810 300 macros were no more than like 4,000, but digital lenses were 7,000 a piece. And I needed at least 3 of each lens, because I had 6 people. And the macro scans were 10,000, and the chips were 40,000. But it meant that we switched from film to digital in '99, and then one of my guys came to me and he said, you know, you've spent $160,000 on a camera, and we've never shown the client a picture. And I'm like, so? And he's like, but when are we going to show clients pictures? And I said, well, when you've all learned this, because I can't have a half analog, half digital studio. Because I was spending somewhere between $40,000 and $45,000 a month on film. I was the biggest purchaser of Fuji Ready Load. And when they changed the film from RDP2 to RDP3, I bought all the stock in America, all the stock in Europe, all the stock in Asia, shipped it to a fridge in Chicago Airport, and had about 30,000 sheets of film, and was able to keep going for 2.5 years because I liked the other film, because you could increase the contrast by pushing the film. And the new film was flat. And the Fuji guy wanted to know why I wouldn't use his film. So they sent him to me from Japan, and he said, what's wrong with my film? And I said, I don't like it. I said, it's flat. And I said, you know, you can't do what, you can't push it a stop and a quarter to increase the contrast anymore. And he said, oh, you know, I make a film for amateur. He said, you know, even professional market is not that big to Fuji. And I said, well, it's big to me. And he said, yeah, but you know, I make film for general people. He said, so they make mistakes. So I've created a slide film that allows you to make mistakes. And I'm like, well, you know, that's no good. And I said, you know, I want something like EPR. And he said, oh, I write a book on EPR. And I said, really? What book was that? And he said, no, I write a manual. And he wrote the manual for EPR because he worked for Kodak. And Kodak had produced a ready-load film that had 2 sheets of film because they'd lost a patent dispute with Polaroid over instant film, and they were frightened. And so they had 2 sheets, but the problem was that the clip at the bottom wouldn't hold it properly. So I kept sending hundreds and hundreds of sheets back to Kodak that were fogged. And that upset Kodak. And they sent their reps down, you know, and I sort of had these people from Rochester, and I sort of said to them, you know, like, why are you doing this? You know, don't you realize the advantages of Fuji? And they said, what advantages? And I sort of showed them, and they said, well, we've never looked at this. And I said, you've never looked at Fujifilm? They said, no. I said, well, maybe that's your problem. You know, maybe it would have helped if you looked at it, because Fujifilm was nothing more than Polaroid film, you know, the 54. Yeah. And we tried to persuade Fuji to buy Polaroid, but they didn't. But they had the license to make it in Japan. And Fuji's Polaroid was even better than Polaroid's Polaroid. And you could actually shoot on Fuji 4x5 Polaroid. You didn't need to go to film, you could just copy that. Right. But once I realized that my RDP2 was running out, I was like, well, we got to go digital. There's no other solution. And so we switched, and I taught all the publishing companies how to go digital and how to deal with digital, and that, you know, this was the future and they should just accept it. Right. And again, it's the technical thing, you know.
So is film dead?
No, I don't. No, I mean, Steve Pike still shoots film. There's I forget what it's called, but there's a project that makes 8-10 Polaroid. I wouldn't shoot film just because the advantages of digital. If we would shoot a product, then I would shoot 6 or 7 variations on it, just instinctively. And on digital, that doesn't cost anything. And we would buy hard drives by the case. So I think I had something like 75 terabytes of storage, which is 220 terabytes of storage, including double backup, plus the raw files, because we didn't throw anything out. Okay. So I've got a room full of hard drives. And then I moved on. I did that until like around 2009. I realized that the publishing companies were building their own versions of my studio, because I had 6 people, so I could spend twice as much time on a picture, and I could do 60 hours of photography in a day. And through working at Apple, there was a program called Remote Desktop that was for spreadsheet managers and allowed you to observe other people's computers. So I fed the 6 cameras into my office, and I had 2 30-inch monitors, and I could see the 6 cameras in real time. Right. So I could see Bill doing a product. I could full screen his monitor, his camera, screen grab his picture before he'd even taken it, email it to a client, get a client approval back before he'd even done, because we did three pictures of everything. Because even though we were in a solid building, you could still get vibration, like you could, you know, tread on a floorboard over here and it would affect something over there, because it was a 110-year-old building. And, you know, we didn't have a couch, because if we had a couch, someone would sit down. We couldn't allow that. And we successfully worked completely anonymously with no one ever coming to the studio. And the ability to deliver pictures really fast for approval, and then using, first off, I guess it was, when I went through from floppies to SideQuests, which was 16 and 44 megabyte. And then opticals were, I think, 132 and 256. And then jazz drives were 500, and then a gigabyte. But my first scanner was 2 flatbed scanners held together with bolts and hinges. And they were $4,000 a piece. And you put telephone books on top of them to scan transparencies. And I messed with animation in very early on, you know, like 2000, animating flowers, and then messed around again with it, with a morphing program, morphing crystal glasses together, knowing that we'd have to wait 5 to 7 years for technology to catch up, which we did. And then I've always done things the most difficult way humanly possible. So
why?
Why not?
Indeed, yeah, okay, touche.
Why make it easy?
Yeah, okay.
I mean, when you have to learn to take pictures upside down and you can't see through the lens, it's quite challenging.
It is, yeah.
So it's good for the brain.
Yes.
And so I started to do rotations where we would do 32 pictures to get one rotation.
Right.
And then retouch 32 pictures to make an object move in a circle, because digital video wasn't good enough. And so I did a whole range of animated videos. I think based on watching Terry Gilliam's Monty Python animations when I was a kid, and thinking that that was cool. So we spent 18 months building those. So now now we don't even use cameras, it's all on CGI. And we use a place in Cleveland and another place in Colorado. And I'm working on this big job that I can't discuss because I have an NDA governing it. But we can take a product and we can make it do anything. So they'll do, you know, 3 or 4 wireframes to make basic products, and then this particular product, I could have made a ton more money if I could take pictures from 45 degrees with a soft shadow, but I just couldn't do it. It's just not in me. And you know, every time the assistants would take a picture, I was like, just lower the fucking camera. Just get the camera on the ground. I mean, I used to hang cameras under, I had CNR studio stands, I had 5 of those. And I would hang cameras underneath them to get them low. Right. Just because that's heroic. That's what I learned from Penn. I mean, now everybody knows how to do it, but they didn't know how to do it. But I could never see at 45 degrees like everybody else could. And there was nothing more hideous to me than a soft shadow. Whereas if you work with an HMI, because the great thing about an HMI, you know, you turn it on and it's a little bit softer and then it just goes pow. Oh, yeah. And then you've got pure unadulterated sunlight. So you put that through a silk and you get the most beautiful light. And once I'd learned to do lipsticks, I thought, oh, well, if you can do lipsticks, you can do cars. So then I moved on to cars. And I mean, the only thing you really have to know about cars is to use talcum powder on the tyres. Right. That's the big trick. That's right. The one that's the one that you don't get. You don't learn. You can't find that one in the books. Right. And Penn was the first person to put a light underneath the car, right, which then caused people to actually put lights under cars and drive around America with lights underneath cars. But the principle is still the same. It's just that if your car's 20 foot long, then you just need a 60 foot long softbox, because your highlight ratio is 3:1. So everything just becomes bigger. So to me, you know, there's no difference between a lipstick and a full length of a car. Because if you can do the lipstick properly, then you can do the car. So I did cars for a while. Because I didn't want to get bored.
Right.
So, you know, I had a phase where I did tech products, flower phase, beauty phase, and then created a photo factory doing shoes and bags, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, because I could employ more people. And I always thought Fridays were the coolest day of the week, because I'd get to shell out, you know, $10,000–12,000 to assistants who had families, and I thought that was the best thing in the world. So I got up to 11 people at one point.
Do you still photograph people?
No.
And why?
Because if I did, it's such a... To build the 810 Cino, you know, the thing is like 4.5 feet long. The amount of light it requires is enormous. People don't necessarily understand it. And once you've gone, you know, Hero used to say this thing about, some days when I come to work, I use a scalpel, and other days I use an axe. And he was referring to the scalpel being 35mm and the axe being 810. And my experience was, once you'd moved from format to format and got to 810, there was no going back. I mean, you try and do portraiture on 4.5, it's just nothing once you've done 810. And up until Keras, I think I'd only done like 6 people in 20 years. I did Barry White, Ry Cooder, Run DMC, Robert Plant, and Elvis. When I first went to America, I did a thing where Avedon would do the covers for GQ and I would do the insides.
Yes.
And they would all tell the same story, that it was 40 minutes in and out, including makeup, hair, and clothing.
Oh, really? God.
And after 3 frames, he would go over to them and say, look, I've got what I need, but I'm going to take another one because the magazine likes it when I do 4. And my friend Keith Morris, who was the other guy that did Elvis, he used to work for Bailey in the 60s, and Avedon used to refer to Bailey as pen without ink. Which basically meant that he realised how good Bailey was. Yeah. And so he would come and do the shows, and he would try and, like, I only ever used photographers. If you want to work for me, I'd have a minimum of 10 years experience as a photographer, not as an assistant. And only then would we hire you. And then we had very specific methods for shooting every kind of product. It was all worked out, exactly where everything would go. And we shot everything on these massive plexiglass cubes that would cost up to $1,200 for a 6x9x12 cube. And then you'd put a shoe on it and then it would silhouette it. And so I could save the client vast amounts of money by doing stuff like that and justify the expense of doing what we were doing, because the investment in digital was so large that you couldn't make it cheaper than film. It had to be the same price. And so we had it all worked out, and Keith had gone out to Paris to do Avedon, to work for Avedon. Avedon had done a whole bunch of pictures of the collection. And he told Keith to bring the test sheets to, I think it was Maxime's or something. And, you know, he holds them up and he goes, okay, minus an eighth, plus a third, whatever. And he said, just run everything. And Keith said, great, you know, and I'll bring the pictures to the hotel and leave them for you. And he said, why? And Keith said, well, you know, so you can look at them. And he said, they're all perfect. Why would I look at them? And I thought, oh, that's confident. But he was that good. And he was doing a series of portraits for Rolling Stone on a grey background. But with Avedon, it's paint. and it's 3 coats of paint at 10-hour intervals.
Right.
So it's 30 hours to paint the grey. Whereas what most photographers do is shoot on white, turn the backlights off.
Yes.
But then you get a greeny grey.
Yes.
But that wasn't good enough for Avedon. So he was doing these portraits, and he did Boy George, and the guy I shared a studio with was out with George, and Avedon came out to the reception and said, "Hey, you know, I'm Dick Avedon, how you doing?" And Andre said, "Oh, you know, very nice to meet you." He said, "There's a guy that shares my studio, and he really, really likes your work, and you know, he would just be amazed that I was here." And Avedon said, "Well then, come in the studio, pick up the phone, and talk him through what I'm doing." And so Andre phoned me and he said, he's not using stands, he's got the light on the end of a stick. It's a monopod, because Balcars, you could get a monopod for a Balcar that went in the back of the pack and balanced the pack. Right. And he said, he's got this thing, and he just shouts out numbers. He says 1 o'clock, and one assistant holds the light at 1 o'clock, and the other assistant holds what I think was a triple silver card that went like, right. It wasn't a conventional card. And then he would go 4 o'clock, and then they move the light. And within 12 frames, he could do 8 different lighting setups.
Just with the one light?
With the one light.
And the card.
And the card. And I tried it, and I couldn't get the exposure right. And with 810, you know, you're talking an eighth of a stop. Mm. And I gave up, and until I finally met Avedon. And we got chatting, and I said, "Look, you know, I hate to ask you this question, but I do have a technical question if you wouldn't mind answering it." And he said, "Yeah, what is it?" And I said, "Well, you probably won't remember this, but you know, you photographed Boy George and you allowed someone to phone a photographer." And he said, "Yeah, I remember that." I said, "Well, that was me." And I said, "You know, one of the things he said was that you operated with a assistant holding the light on a boom." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "How do you get perfect exposure?" And he said, "Well, it's easy. The second assistant stands and his back of his head touches the head and his finger touches the nose of the sitter. And that's how we gauge the distance." And he said, "Every time I change assistants, I have to get a new distance and we have to work it all out." But he would shoot 4, 5, 6 jobs in a day. And so I learned a lot from that. And when I'd gone to New York and I was looking for a printer, I asked the people at Vogue, and I said, "You know, who are the best black and white printers?" And they said, "Well, Avedon's got his own, but Penn uses this place called Lab One, but they don't take people on. But you know, we can ask." And so they asked Lab One, and they said, "You know, tell him to bring in his pictures." So I took my pictures in, and the place was, you know, full of Clinique ads. Not ads, actually, the press pictures. And they looked at my work and said, "Yeah, this is pretty good." And I said, "Well, you know, would you take me on?" And they said, "Sure." And so I did a series of portraits, and I did Al Gore, and I did the guy that invented Lotus 123, and Bobby McFerrin. And the magazine ordered up, because the way it was done then, that you would order a range of prints, which was like ridiculously expensive. Right. And Paul Windsor at Downtown would make their money because he would shoot ads on Fridays for like the Conservative Party and stuff to run as billboards that would all go through at triple the rates. And a range was you'd get 3 prints that were fractionally different from each other. And I looked at these prints and I'm like, the bottom right-hand corner is not sharp. And so I went out and I got, you know, magnifying glass, and I was convinced that there was something wrong. And I went to Lab One and I said, "I hate to say this," I said, "but there's something wrong in your darkroom." They said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The part of this picture's not sharp." And they said, "No, that's your camera." I said, "It's not my camera. There's something wrong." I said, "Would you mind if I went into the darkroom with a spirit level and see whether or not something's wrong?" And they said, "What is it with you English guys?" I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, Bailey was here last week. He said exactly the same thing that you did." I said, okay, so will you let me in with the spirit level? Because you obviously didn't let him in with the spirit level. And they said, no, we threw him out. So I went in with the spirit level, and sure enough, it was half a degree off. Right. And so the enlarger board was twisted. But, you know, that's what I'd learned from Mick, you know, it's all about precision. Yeah. And the point light source enlargers on rails, so you could turn it on its side and print on a wall. So I was doing 60/40s back in the early 80s. So this stuff at the museum's nothing new.
Nothing new at all. The exhibition at the museum, this holding back of pictures for 35 odd years, was it ever a temptation to release them sooner?
No.
What was the mindset behind holding them back?
It was two conversations, one with Elvis Costello's manager and one with Pete Townsend, about whether or not what we were all doing would have any long-term cultural value. And that if we thought we were as cool as we thought we were, then maybe it would. And I personally felt that music finished in 1982. And that once the New Romantics came in, it was dead. And so I thought, well, why not? Given that by 86 I was doing like George Michael and people like that and making loads of money. And then I realized I wasn't playing the music of the people that I was photographing, and I thought that was a sin. Mm. So I thought you should always be photographed by someone that admires you. And so I thought, well, if you're going to make money out of photography, then go to America, go to New York. And my friends would drop in like flies. And when Phil Lynott died, it really had quite an effect on me. And so I thought, well, what can we do that would give us a job for the rest of our lives? And we thought, well, the printed word is on white paper. So if you take pictures of objects on a white background, which wasn't the style at the time. I mean, it was done occasionally. Clinique did it, and Apple did it, but not by the magazines didn't do it. The only place I ever saw it was in Playboy. And at the back of Playboy, there were 2 pages of sort of fitness machines and stuff that were done on white. And I thought, maybe that's a good idea. And so we produced 2 portfolios, which one was an entire issue of The Face from beginning to end. And the other one was Arena, and Arena was still life and The Face was people. And I took that to America. And I didn't realize that people knew who we were. So I got to America on the Wednesday, did Denzel Washington on the Friday, a bunch of Kennedys the following week, and I worked every day for the next 27 years. Wow. I didn't come back here for 17 years, because I forgot. And there was this sort of story about there was me, Albert Watson and Patrick de Marchelier, and we worked day and night. I mean, we literally worked day and night. I had one guy that came in and worked from 9 until 8, and another guy that came in at 8 and worked from 8 until 2. And then, because I was British, I wouldn't steal Bill because he worked for somebody else, and I didn't think that you couldn't do that. So I had to wait for the person he was working for to lose enough clients that she couldn't have him full time, so then he came to work for me. And then Clinique asked for 3 sets, and then I upped that to 6 and found 6 photographers that had all been trained up by Macy's. And if you can do chains, you know, you can do anything. Mm-hmm. And the level of patience required.
Yes, to move each link.
To move each link. And again, the precision thing comes back into it. And so I had no, you know, like Jeff, my retoucher, would say to me, I'd say, can you do this? And he'd say, well, that's going to take a long time. And I'm like, how long? 8, 12 hours? And he's like, yeah. I said, well, that's not a long time. 30 hours is a long time, but there's nothing long about 8 or 12 hours to get something right. And it was the same thing with the guys, you know, I had a guy that he specialised in watches, and another guy that did the shoes and bags, and then we pinned clothing. Everybody just threw clothing down, and it looked awful. Mm. And so we developed a technique of pinning clothing to a board, so that it hangs properly. And you use these T-pins, and you put hundreds and hundreds of pins into the clothing, and then you pull the clothing forwards, and then you snip off the pins, and the dress hangs there.
Right, okay.
And so we did that.
Remarkable.
Well, I did say I never did anything simply.
No.
But it made the clothing look good.
I bet it did, yeah.
And then the other way to do it was to pin it to mannequins.
Right.
And it was just about working at there used to be a thing called advertising standards, that you would work to. An advertising standard was quite serious level. Mm. And so I did everything like that. And working on the principle that if you photograph a Clinique product, it's a comp, it's going to look awesome. But if you're stuck doing Avon, you know, you've got this cheap, nasty thing. So if you photograph it large format, you can make it look better.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I you know, we would do, like we did a yogurt thing. And I said to the guy that owned it, I said, look, you know, the most important thing isn't the yogurt, it's the labels. And your labels are just like, you know, the grain is huge. Right. Let me just recreate the labels for you. And I guarantee you that when the bus goes by with your label, your yogurt, it'll look better than the other people's yogurt, and you'll sell more. And he did.
The exhibition is going to raise your profile again in, I expect, Wales, Britain.
I guess.
What consequences do you think will come from that new exposure of your work? Are you concerned about that, or does it not bother you?
I mean, I was talking to my friend earlier about it, and she was saying, you know, why don't you do people again? And I'm like, oh, I don't know, really. I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, the problem for me is that the standard of photography has dropped enormously, and everything's done really cheaply, and I don't know how to do things cheaply. And, you know, as I said before, that references back to the Pink Floyd comment about if something's expensive, there's a really good reason why.
Yes. So
either you let me do it on a phone, or it's going to cost you a fortune. Right. But I don't like colour.
Although there's a shot you did of Elvis Costello in a yellow jacket, and that is a wonderful shot.
Well, that's a colour picture.
That's a colour picture, yes. And the broken Townsend guitar as well.
Yeah, that's a colour picture.
That's a colour picture. But there aren't many of your colour pictures I've seen.
No, I mean, I had no interest in it.
Can I ask you why?
Because if you take pictures in black and white, your brain has to think. Because your brain has to convert the information from black and white to colour. And even though you don't know what's going on, your brain is being activated. And there's a process going on there that I think is important. And, you know, kids don't like black and white, and kids don't, you know, and everybody's colorizing.
Yeah. And
I've always just loved black and white, so, you know, my phone only takes black and white pictures. Right. And it's a fixed lens. Yeah. So it's just like a Hasselblad. And you can squish it to a square.
Yes.
And I don't mind doing that. But I don't know like it was interesting because, you know, in order to take pictures of Keras, I've got this little girl that I've been mentoring from Bridgend, and you know, you put your hand on their shoulder and you just squeeze their shoulder so that they know when to take the pictures. Because there's in our big 4.5s, there's this, you know, the thing about any large format camera is that you have the cable release ready to be a split second away from a picture.
Yes.
And you wait for it and you get it very quickly. And I don't think that's particularly difficult, and I don't think you find it particularly difficult either.
No.
But with digital, there's a delay, and you have to learn the delay. And so as I didn't operate the cameras, I couldn't learn the delay. So I would just do it with one of my guys called Francis, and I would just squeeze when the picture was coming and let him do it.
Why the mentoring? Why have you, this girl from Bridgend?
Well, there were three,
right,
actually.
Okay.
One of them takes pictures that she's in, but they're not selfies, they're pictures. And I didn't notice for a while that the girl that was in the pictures was actually the photographer. And I think she's really good. And then there's another girl in New Jersey, and then there's this sort of girl in Bridgend, and I've been, you know, I get a lot of Facebook friend requests, and I see thousands and thousands of bad pictures. But I saw this stuff, and it was like weddings, and I thought, this person's quite good. So I watched her for a year, and I thought, actually, this person's really good. And I think I sent her a message, and I said, you know, your pictures are really good. But she didn't know who I was, which was perfect. But she did tell her tutor, and she said, I keep getting these messages from this guy in America called Chalkie Davies. And he's like, what? And she's like, yeah, he keeps telling me things. Like, have you tried this? And why does that hand resemble a pig's trotter? And why are you not doing this? And do you realize that you're falling 1 degree to the left? And she said, you know, he's really helping. And he's like, you obviously don't know who that person is. And she said, no. And he said, well, you know, he's quite an accomplished photographer. And she started to do bands, and they may be called Pretty Vicious or something like that, but they're a Welsh band.
Right, okay.
But she's taking pictures of the mundanity of rock and roll.
Right.
And most of rock and roll is mundane.
Yes.
And she's really good. And so I've had her on these BBC shoots, and the pictures that she's taken of me and of the people that are being interviewed, she's really, you know, she's really, really good. She's got the eye. She disappears into the corner. And when the one show asked if I'd do it, and I was like, if I do a picture and I have to bring in, you know, an assistant from 30 years ago, and Balcar umbrellas, and large format cameras, it's going to cost a fortune, and you're not. And then they said, well, you know, we can film this, and I said, no. They said, what do you mean? I said, no. I said, no one's ever seen how we work. I've always had closed sets. I said, ask anybody. And they said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, you know, I've got a little girl, she can take pictures. I said, but no way do you get to film it, because what happens between the photographer and the sitter is all this crap where you say things like, think nice thoughts, or think of your kids. And there's a dialogue, and that shouldn't, I've never seen anybody film photography very well. It comes across badly. The photographer comes across looking like an idiot. And I just said, you know, no. And they said, but you know, will you take a picture? And I'm like, yeah, but I won't let you film it. And then I started working with Steve Freer on the BBC thing. And one of my best friends is Martin Baker, whose father was Sir Stanley Baker. And I mentioned him to Steve, and he said, oh, you know Martin? And I said, yeah, really, really well. And he said, oh, I made a film on the Bakers, on Stanley. And I said, oh, that's interesting. And he told me some stories, you know, because I used to go to Lady Baker's for Sunday lunch. And I said, that's great. I said, I'll pass on my regards, because I had lunch with her last year. And so I wrote to one of Stanley's sons, and I said, I'm being filmed by this guy called Steve Freer. And he wrote back and said, oh, he's fantastic. He said, he's really, really good. Like, just send him, you know, love from the Baker family. So I said to him, you know, the Baker family send their regards. He said, what are you talking about? I said, well, I wrote to him, mentioned your name. And he said, but that was 20 years ago. They remember it. And I said, yeah, people have a tendency to remember good things. Mm. And he has been, you know, very easy to work with, and I roped in all my mates. And so I had Rebecca working on that, and she was doing well. So then I Skyped her and I said, look, I have to do this Keris thing, but the reason they can't come there, because if they see how it's done, they're going to freak out, because they're going to see someone who doesn't take the pictures until the end, who, you know, has a very odd way of working, because most people think photographers like taking pictures. But, you know, I'm not particularly bothered about that bit, because that's the easy bit. It's the same as Hitchcock, you know. Someone asks you to take a picture, you take it in your mind, you work it out, and then you're stuck doing it. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing worse. Yeah. And so I didn't tell anybody what my intention was, but my intention was to do it on the phone, and I thought that it would be a way of bringing photography from, you know, 40 years ago into the modern world, and explaining about people having phones, and to try and get this point across about asking people to just please take less photographs. And Keris, so I phoned little Rebecca, you know, and I didn't realise she's only a second year student, and she's already working. And I said, look, I have to do this thing. How would you feel about doing Keris Matthews for me? And she said, well, I'll do that. So I was confident. She said, yeah, no problem. But, you know, she got here today and she was getting a little, well, she's been nervous for a couple of days about it. And I said, there's nothing to be nervous about, because let's just see what happens. And so she took pictures with her 35mm so that I could see how to photograph Keris, you know, who wears a hat.
Yes.
And hats are not easy.
No. And
she's conscious of aspects of her face.
Yes.
But people like me know how to deal with that. And, you know, I keep moving her, and she said, why do you keep moving me back over here? And I'm like, well, because that's where you look good. So just sort of trust me. And so I would let Becky go in and do, I don't know, she would do 10, 12 frames or something, and then I'd move her out the way, and then I'd go in and do a bunch on the phone, and I'd look at mine. But unfortunately I tripped on the BBC's lights, because I'm used to, okay, if we've got cables, we have rubber mats that go over them. So I tripped and banged my elbow on my wrist, and I was shaking a little bit. And so I was worried that because I was using BBC lights, which is all LED lights. I've never used those in my life, but that's what Becky knows. And so I said, you know, it'd be interesting to see what happens. So I moved in and did mine. I think I did three bursts, and Becky did, I guess, 4. And then my policy's always been to show the person the picture and agree on what's the best picture. So Keris is going through it, and she's knocking out about 95%. But that's fine, because I do the same thing. And we settled on 3 pictures, and then I said, you know, we don't really need 3, why don't we just settle on 1? So we settled on 1. And I bounced it from the phone to the iPad, took it into Pixelmator, put a vignette on it, which took the background down. And then I said, you know, now you should look at what Becky's got. And, you know, Becky had all these great pictures, but she had one where Keris was looking away, which I tried to explain to people was actually the best picture that was taken.
Yeah.
And that I was proving a point, was that just because I'm well known, it doesn't mean that there's not another person that can take a really good picture.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was an interesting experiment.
Yes.
To show people that if you nurture people properly and you don't push, I don't tell her how to take pictures. Like, she does fashion, she does theatre groups, and she's way ahead of everybody else at her school, to the point where, I took her on Monday we filmed at the Ffoton Library, because the Ffoton Library has everything from Fox Talbot onwards, and that's where my negatives live. And I did a deal with Getty whereby they scanned everything for the show, and they get to have my archive as part of their archive. And I took her there, and Matt, that runs it, was looking at Becky's pictures, and he's like, you're really good. And she said, yeah, Chalkie keeps telling me the same thing. And I said, do you not grasp that you wouldn't be here if you weren't good? Yeah. Do you really think that, these compliments are not genuine? That I'm not, I'm schlepping you around for a reason? And the fact that you're Welsh is even better. So, but I'm trying to prove that you should Brian Griffin, who is probably the greatest, they're different, but Nick Knight and Brian Griffin would be, the best photographers the second part of the 20th century. And BG is just, he's on another planet and a whole other plane. And he had a policy where he would hire an assistant for a year and give them what he called the knowledge. And the knowledge is what London taxi drivers have to do. And then after a year, he would let them go.
Wonderful.
And bring in a new one.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, encouraging Becky in my own little way, because I don't tell her what to do. I just give her small tips, little things here, little things there, things to watch. But I think it's, part of the reason to do the show is to see if we could get people interested in photography, because now everybody's got a camera. They didn't have that before. And, I have a personal theory about Instagram, that the reason Instagram is so successful is because it's a square
format,
and that you don't see 35mm. You think you do, but you only see 35mm when your eyes go wide or you go close. But if you unfocus your eyes and you do this, it's actually a square. And a square is an easier shape to compose in. And I think part of the big thing with Instagram is that it isn't 35mm.
Yeah.
Because the only other camera that I use a Panavision app that takes a 2.35 to 1 ratio picture. And I got it from Ron Howard, and it was expensive. It was $30 for an app.
Right, yeah.
But what it does is you can do anything from, I'm a numerical person, so when the museum says to me, what height do you want the pictures, we normally put them at 58, but we did once put them at 60, and I'm like, well, 59. And they're like, why 59? I said, because 59 is a prime number.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And 64 is 8 squared. So there's lots of mathematics. And I listen to Bach a lot. And Bach is, music is mathematics. It goes back to Pythagoras, who, woke up one morning and looked at architecture and said, well, it's either a triangle, a variant on a rectangle, or a variant on a circle. So, architecture's mathematics. And then he woke up one day and sort of looked at the lyre and looked at music and thought, yeah, music is math too. And then towards the end of his life, because everybody just thinks he's the square on the hypotenuse thing, but there's Pythagorean commas. I mean, this very serious dude. And towards the end of his life, he said, all life itself is mathematics. And if you can describe, an organism in a non-mathematical term, then you'll prove him wrong. So I believe in the rhythm of numbers and natural rhythm. So that means that you can working 1.33 to 1, 2 to 3, 16 by 9, or 2.35 to 1. And the Panavision camera allows you to, I mean, what Ron did with it was he went out to study all the racetracks for Rush. You take this app on your phone and you take your picture from here, and it records every conceivable piece of information. The time, the sun, the light, the height above sea level, the height above the ground, the GPS, the angle. And then you go back with your film crew and you take this iPhone and you put it in exactly the right place, and then they put the camera there. Right. And so that means that you can prep everything. Right. And so I use that for wide angle pictures, for 2.35 to 1s.
Rebecca is a very lucky girl to have you as a mentor.
I think she's very talented.
Will you take her over to New York?
Oh no, no. She won't. Well, she may. Yeah, I mean, she may come with a group and everything, but
right.
No, it's not that. I have no intention of doing that. It's more just, it's Facebook. You know, it's the power of Facebook of seeing somebody good and being able to help them. Yeah. And they just happen to be Welsh, and I just happen to have a show here, and it just seemed like a perfect
symmetry.
Yeah, you know, and I think that's. I think she'll end up, you know, on The Guardian or whatever pretty soon. Fantastic. After she leaves school, because she's that good. Right. And she does all sorts of stuff. And it's interesting because doing this BBC thing, I said, look, you know, you got to realise that this is a union situation here, so you can't touch these lights. You have to, you know. She's like, what do you mean? I said, well, you know, I once made a film and I was so frustrated I went up the ladder and moved the barn door. Hey. And 3 men surrounded the ladder and said, can we help you, Mr. Davies? And I said, yeah, you can do what I ask you, and please, you know, can you just get this fucking barn door in the right place? And she was like, well, you know, the film crew's not going to be here, right? Because I don't let people see how I do it. And I'm like, oh, that's good. You're learning. Because she's protective about what she does. And I think it's because she's so good that the tutors are intimidated by her talent. So when she went back and she said, oh, you know, I was at the Houghton Library and they thought my pictures were good. and he was sort of like, oh, fair enough. And I'm thinking, no, not fair enough. These 2 people run the Houghton Library, that they know more about photography than anybody else. Mm-hmm. If you wish to dismiss her for that, then, you know, there's a jealousy aspect involved here, which I thought was, you know, sort of typical, unfortunately.
Yes. It is typical of education, as we find it anyway, and in our little sort of world down here in Wales, we find, you know, that sort of attitude towards young photographers, and it's a tougher world for young photographers because the access is not available as it was in your day. And that becomes an impossibility. There's so many gatekeepers today, and PR people I had an example of it. I went to a Hustings. I wanted to take some photographs at a Hustings, and the Labour guy was playing me. He wasn't because he was aware that he should behave properly and that he mustn't do anything untoward, and he would look straight into my lens and things, which was kind of weird, really. But there we are. The other people weren't so PR savvy, but he really was, which was a bit frightening. But I don't think kids get the opportunity the real opportunities.
Yeah, and also because she's a girl.
Yeah.
But I think that there are a lot of really good female photographers.
Yes.
And I think you've only got to look at Jane Bown and Sally Soames and Diane Arbus to realise that it's not a male-dominated industry. And the other thing I didn't realise, when I first went to America and I met Albert Watson and stuff, and I'm like, God, you're old. You know, he was only 50 and I was 33, and I was like, why do you get all the work? And then as you start to get into advertising and you start to get big jobs, and you know, I mean, I did jobs where I built the interiors of planes and would have 30 people working on a set and budgets of $200,000 or $250,000 for a week's worth of work. They won't give that to someone unless they know what they're doing.
Indeed.
And I began to realise that that's what it really was. That it wasn't about how good you were, it was how good was your depth of knowledge. Could you go to work knowing that your daily bill was $40,000 or $50,000? And the thing that I did for Continental, because I worked as an aircraft engineer, when I was up for the job and they wanted it shot large format, and it was a global campaign, which meant there were 16 different combinations of ethnicities and models and everything else, and it was all about Continental had the new version of the first class seat that had servo motors in it, and they said, you know, are you sure you can build a plane? And I said, yeah. And I told them the distances between seats and the bulkheads, and they said, oh, you know what a bulkhead is? I said, yeah, of course I know what a bulkhead is. And explained certain aspects, and they said, oh, you can do it. And so I had 12-12 silk with 16 heads as the main light, and an 8-8 silk with 12 heads as the fill light. And then another 8 heads behind the windows, and then I had a guy come in and paint a sky, and they were like, why are you painting a sky? And I'm like, well, because this is a plane. And they said, but nobody paints skies. I'm like, well, I do. So I forget how many heads it was, but it was something like 40 heads and probably 128, 200,000 joules. I mean, you know, it's all 6,400 joule packs, single heads. And just coordinating that and syncing that together is, you know, quite a big job. And then I had one guy in the corner just doing the food. And then I worked in a big film studio, and I had to do the flight attendants. And I asked if I could use models, and was told no. And I said, there'll be a problem, trust me, because the way that I work to make these pictures graphic, you know, these people have to really understand what I want. And they kept moving apart, and I needed them to be compressed and to form a unit. So I sewed them together.
Have you ever been tempted to make a movie? Would you like to make a movie?
I made a film for MTV, half-hour film on Pete Townsend, for the first week of MTV.
Right.
Never made another one. My friend Anton makes films now.
Right.
Never particularly thought about it.
No.
I like making things move, but I don't think that it has to, you know, you got a movie, it's all, you know, producers and dialogue and happy endings and all that sort of stuff. It's just, I've just never really thought about it. You know, lots of photographers may wish to do that. That's fine by me.
Yeah. So what next, Chalkie?
I think I'm very interested in the CGI aspect of things, and the concept that, you know, for the internet to become what people think it will be is actually quite a slow process. But, you know, you're already getting ads in the back of taxis. And hopefully Apple TV will switch to taking over from cable boxes, which means there'll be room for non-union based advertising. And thus we can make commercials for $50,000, $60,000 instead of $200,000, because we don't have to employ all the people. So I fancy doing a bit of that. And you know, who knows, maybe somebody will ask me to take pictures of people. I have no idea. But it's just not, you know.
Would you put on an exhibition of your commercial work at all? Or do you think that would not interest people?
I mean, there's some very interesting stuff there where the problem that we had with the Face and Arena was that we couldn't reproduce more than one photograph per page. And so my deal was that I got the good pages at the front and the back, the higher quality paper, that then correspond to the higher quality ads, to do still life. And so we learnt to do 10 or 12 objects in a single frame on white, which is, you know, they're big. They're sort of like 6 by 9 feet. And then I got to America and they wanted it all done individually so the art director could lay it out. And I was like, well, why don't you just let us do it? But they didn't want that. You know, there's some really beautiful work. It's interesting, but I don't. You know, this show is a specific thing of a specific period of time that has a validity. I'm not sure that the commercial work, that there's enough of it to justify it under my rigid standards of what is and what's not good. You know, I mean, I said to the museum, there's 81 museum quality photographs, but there's not 82. And we're using 64.
Cool. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.